Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Mike Smitherman with Metric Insights, and today our main speaker is going to be Marius Moscovici, our founder and CEO. Hi, Marius.
Hello, Mike.
So the usual housekeeping items. So mics are muted, obviously, because of the amount of people we've got on here. But as we go through the webinar, as usual, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A or chat windows. We'll keep track of those, answer them as we go along, or get to them at the end. Yes, we are recording the session, so we'll send out a link afterwards if you want to share that with the rest of your team. And our topic today is actually going to cover quite a large number of areas as it relates to building a successful analytics catalog. And again, given the time we have, we don't have the opportunity to go particularly deep into all of them. So I'd encourage you to reach out in the chat window as we go through this. If there's particular areas of interest to you, I'd be happy to schedule follow-up webinars that maybe drill into these areas. So looking for your feedback on that. And so with that, let's get going here. So the topic today is 5 steps to building a successful analytics catalog. And I guess, Marius, let's kick off with maybe defining what success is.
Yeah, that's a good place to start. Thank you, Mike. So when you think about success, you think about, okay, I'm going to go and build myself an analytics catalog. There are really 3 different classes of stakeholders that you need to think about, because really success means something different to each of these different types of stakeholders, and you need to be able to address all their needs to be successful. So broadly speaking, those are your BI publishers, everyone that's basically creating content of any kind, analytics content to be consumed within the organization. That could be your data scientist, it could be your analyst, it could be somebody generating spreadsheets and reports. BI consumers, the folks that are going to be coming to your catalog to find reports and answer their business questions, right? That's probably the largest constituency you have to support. And then finally, you've got your governance team. And the governance team is responsible for making sure the proper guardrails are in place. So making sure you meet compliance requirements, and then making sure you meet best practices requirements so that the information is used appropriately, is not overshared, and is not disseminated in places that it should not go. So let's look at a little more detail as to what each of these audiences really looks for in terms of the solution, what constitutes success for each of them. So as a BI publisher, what do you want? You want to make sure that you have some kind of a solution where you can publish your relevant content to users with as close to 0 effort as possible, right? That's very important, because as a content publisher, I've gone through a lot of effort to create my content. The last thing I want is some kind of an onerous process to get my content published in the catalog for people to use. In fact, if that process requires anything more than just almost a trivial amount of effort, you probably lost me, right? It's going to be very hard to get me to do the publishing. So minimizing that effort. Secondarily, I want to be able to easily associate whatever metadata I need to capture from a governance perspective or from a data literacy perspective with that content, make it really easy for me to capture that metadata. And then, of course, have the assurance as I'm publishing this content that security is properly maintained for all my reporting. So obviously, last thing I want as an analyst is to push the report out and then have it go to the security model somehow where it's being used by the wrong people or inaccessible people that shouldn't use it. So that's security, obviously very important. From a consumer perspective, very different kind of needs, right? As a BI consumer, first and foremost, it's going to be very important to me to make sure that all my relevant information is available with a single search. So, if you don't satisfy this in the catalog, you're not even getting an auto starting gate. So everything that I use to make my decisions needs to be there at my fingertips. I search for it, I find it, and I start using it. I need to be able to distinguish between the really highly trusted, that certified content, that stuff that's been vetted, where that analysis is guaranteed to use the right source of information. It's using the right nomenclature, the right business terms. From the things that may be a little less trustworthy. Maybe just an analyst created this, it might be useful and interesting, but I don't necessarily have that same level of trust in that content. Knowing which is which is very important. I also want to be able to discover and request access the things that I don't yet have access to. So, maybe there's something adjacent to my field where my particular group where I haven't been given access to that content, but when I search, I want to be able to know that it exists and then be able to request access to it. So I can really benefit from everything that's available in that organization. And then finally, maybe most importantly, I want to look at the content that I'm consuming in a way that I get to understand it in context, right? So I have that critical metadata around the glossary definitions, other kinds of data source, lineage, things that will tell me where does this come from, how is the data defined here, what key terms is it used, so that I know how to interpret the information. I know if the thing that I'm looking at, when I'm asking a question about sales, does it contain sales as defined the way I think of it, or is there the way a completely different definition where I need to interpret the numbers differently? So all of these would matter to me. And then if you look at that third set of users, or the governance team, what are they interested in? Well, of course, it's all about the guardrails, right? So they want to make sure that all the things that are in this catalog are going to be tagged with the correct classification and certification metadata. So the things that are certified are marked as certified, the things that are not are not. Things are classified from a data sensitivity perspective correctly, right? So that I know users know whether they're dealing with PII data, are they dealing with restricted information, or is this, hey, I'm dealing with publicly available data in this visualization, so I don't really need to worry about sending it out and sharing it with somebody outside our organization. So having that kind of information, and then making sure that users are aware and somehow validated that they know what the usage limits are around what they're consuming. So it's not only important for make sure that only the right users are using that sensitive information, but they also want to make sure they know that to somehow validate that those users understand what the usage constraints are around that information. And then to do that, of course, I need to understand usage analytics across everything that's there. So especially the sensitive content, I really want to make sure I know who's consuming that. And then from an access request perspective, having an auditable process so that if there's a piece of content, especially those that have sensitive data, and somebody wants to have access to it and they don't get access, that there's an auditable, verifiable process through which they're given access to that so that they can trace through and validate it retroactively. So the bulk of this presentation here, we're going to talk about really the 5 steps to putting together a plan that successfully deploy an analytics catalog and meet the success criteria we just talked about across all those constituents. And in doing so, today's presentation, we're not going to show any demo, any product, or anything like that. And it was specifically geared this in a way that I believe that all these things are really generalized across any way that you would be deploying your catalog. Whether you're using metric insights, whether you're using some other technology, competing technology, or if you're just building a catalog from scratch yourself, right? And these steps and these ideas all apply, and these really represent kind of a distilled set of best practices that we've learned in deploying it across all these solutions, across many customers for the past decade. So, first step, right? The first step we're going to talk about is really getting an understanding of the scope of your reporting. And what do I mean by that? Well, in most organizations, you can think of the reporting assets that are there kind of as an iceberg, right? And there's the top of the iceberg. There's the part that's above the water line, and that part would represent the analyst-generated reporting. Right, so here you're think about things like Tableau and Power BI and MicroStrategy and business objects, and whatever tools you happen to use, traditional reporting tools, things or even data science assets that people are creating using or Shiny or any number of frameworks. They're basically assets. They're created by a business intelligence professional, and they're or data scientists. Using a tool that's specifically targeted towards visualizing that technology at scale. These tools all have built-in security models within them. And this is the content that most of us think about when we think about BI assets and analytics. And indeed, this is where most analysts spend their time. But if you look at most organizations of any size, what you discover is that there is a huge amount of information, reporting assets that are below the surface, that are in this sort of part of the iceberg that is not directly visible here. And those are the user-generated content, user-generated reporting. These can be Excel spreadsheets that an analyst creates and shares broadly with a team, maybe budget versus forecast analysis. And how are we doing versus budget? And they're sending that to all the department heads, and they're receiving that once a month, and they're making decisions based off of that. It could be Word analysis. It could be PowerPoint presentations, the synthesized analysis across multiple different dashboards that are pulled together, and as well as some kind of market analysis that was performed. It could be PDF documents, things that are sitting in SharePoint or OneDrive. Or on your own sort of shared drive infrastructure. There are all these assets that fall broadly into this user-generated reporting class that exist in organizations. And in some organizations that may represent a 50% or less of the content, but in many organizations it actually represents the vast majority of content you consume. And in all organizations, this is a significant source of reporting to end users. And thereby, it cannot be ignored, right? If you come up with a strategy that only addresses the analyst-generated reporting, right? If you only look at the top of the iceberg, well, if you do that, you are doing that at your peril, because you will, we know, right, that with icebergs, for Titanic, for many other ships that have sort of ignored the bottom of the iceberg, it did not work out so well for them. And I can tell you now with certainty, if you do not consider user-generated content when you come up with your portal or catalog strategy, then you're basically doomed to fail. Your strategy will crash. And it's for a very simple reason, right? And that is that as a user, as a consumer of analytics, if the catalog that you provide me does not give me access to everything I need, if when I search there, I'm only finding a subset of information, and I have to go somewhere else to find the rest of the information, you've lost me. The catalog is no good, and I'm just going to go to the sources of information, and avoid the catalog entirely. Right. So for that reason, you're not giving me the single pane of glass. I'm not going to use it. So you have to consider this user-generated content and make sure that your strategy encompasses that, along with all of the BI-generated content that we all of us like to think about. So assuming you really have a good understanding of what is all the content that you bring in, what part is analyst-generated, what part is user-generated, what are the different types and the things. The next step is really thinking about security and discoverability in your portal. And what you're looking for here at a very high level is to establish a balance between security, making sure that only the users that should be able to see the details of a particular report are seeing it, and discoverability, as defined by the ability to give users the ability to know that a report exists, even if they cannot actually see its content, and have a mechanism by which they can request access to that report. Now, what happens in most organizations, they start off where this teeter-totter is way out of balance on the security side. Because security exists in all underlying BI tools. And so traditionally, organizations start and they have things locked down in a way where the author of a report, when they create it, they figure out which group of users they believe should have access to it. They grant access to those users can see it. And then no one else can see that report. No one else knows that that report exists. Now that's the right treatment for perhaps your most sensitive content, right? You don't want some HR reporting, payroll type reporting. It's probably nobody else's business outside of the payroll department to know that that reporting exists. And so that's fair and correct treatment for that. But it's not the correct treatment for most of the reporting. Similarly, if you look at discoverability, you don't want to have the teeter-totter go the other way. While it's true that most content should be made discoverable, you don't want everything to be discoverable. For two reasons, and not just for the reason that I just mentioned previously. There's some highly sensitive information that you don't want people to be aware that exists in a report. Only the small group should see that. That's one reason. But a second, and maybe even more important reason why that's important, is because if you expose me to everything in my organization as a user, you're just throwing a huge amount of clutter at me. Right? I'm coming to search for things that are relevant to me and my job function. So I want to know things that maybe I don't have access to that I could request. That's fair. That's added value. But if you're throwing things at me that are completely irrelevant to me, then you're just making it more difficult for me to find that content. So you don't want to have things imbalanced in the other direction either, where everything's discoverable. That's a mistake as well. And so typical, this is, these numbers are just representative, but a typical breakout here that's healthy is to say, well, you've got maybe 5% of your content that should be discoverable to no one, right? Just accessible to people that should have access to it. No one else discovers it. That's the most sensitive, restricted information. If you're a publicly held company, there's a usually restricted act list for forward-looking forecasts and things like that. Everything's locked down for that, and so forth. There's another 5% that maybe is discoverable to everyone, maybe even accessible to a large group of people. So in general reports, these are things that are publicly available information about company performance, or things that are potentially anyone in the organization can see because it doesn't contain any sensitive data at all. Right? So there's a small amount like that. And then the vast majority, 95% of the content, or some, or 90% or things of that nature, right? It should be accessible. I just realized this isn't add up to 100. Sorry, let's call it 95 and 5. 90% of it should be accessible to only the group of people, accessible to the people you've assigned to, and discoverable by groups that are adjacent to that content. So for example, let's think about this. This is typically done by function. Perhaps there's a lead analysis report, and that's really used by the marketing organization to understand the effectiveness of the leads they're generating, which events are generating more leads, what is the disposition of those leads, etc. So that's maybe granted to the marketing team. But the sales team may be interested in understanding what's going on with their leads, because that's funneling into the sales process. So because the sales function is adjacent to the marketing function, you probably want to make that content discoverable to anyone that is in the marketing organization. In addition to the sales organization, also maybe the executive team, maybe they haven't specifically asked for that report, they look for it, but if they're looking for analysis on leads, they should be able to find that it's available and request it. But probably not the factory worker that's out there in the operations group, right? So that operations team shouldn't see that report. So kind of that's the idea, right? The idea is thoughtfully creating a discoverability within scope of people that are likely to find that content meaningful and therefore request access. So now let's talk about security. Let's talk about it in a little bit more depth. So when we think about security, there are a few key principles that come into play that are really important. First of all, your catalog security must be established to be in alignment with your corporate identity system, right? So you do not want, obviously, a portal that has access controls that are completely independent to your single sign-on system, your Okta, your Ping, whatever you're using for your SAML single sign-on, all that has, so that now users have to sign in twice. So by default, table stakes, you've got to integrate with your centralized single sign-on identity system, right? Then you also need to make sure that your portal, when you think about portal security, there's kind of two levels to think about, right? What do people see when they get to the portal? Which reports can they find, can they have access to? That is controlled by the portal security model, right? And we need to make sure that that portal security model is properly defined and synchronized to do that. So that defines what I as a user can find and have access to. But then once I click into a report and I'm actually consuming it, if it's iframed or if I'm home, I'm consuming it, then that actual experience within the report, the row level security that might be in that report, what's happening to what kind of customized behavior, that is always delegated to the reporting tool itself. So you don't, in that way, all the security can be maintained and enforced in a uniform way. So again, access, what I have access to at the catalog level, what happens once I access something, my interaction and low-level security and experience with that content, that's done natively within the reporting. When you look at security, like so the question becomes, how do we synchronize that access? Right? Because that's obviously very important. You don't want to have a situation where I've got to create the access at two places, right? That would create a huge onerous administrative responsibility onto content publishers and administrators. That would be way too burdensome. So what do? Well, a few options. First of all, you can set up security so that you're leveraging your corporate identity and group management systems. So that could be your LDAP or AD groups that you have, your Office 365 groups, or your SAML groups, whatever you're using. If you're using these things already to align access to your content, whether that be the content that you put in SharePoint, or whether that be the Tableau content or Power BI, however, if that's already in place, then what you want to do is you want to leverage that same metaphor to be able to set the contents and security within the catalog itself. So we'll talk a little bit more in depth in a moment about what that means. So that's one scenario. A second scenario is if you maybe don't have that. Maybe you're managing the security directly inside of the tool security model. All of these products, Tableau, MicroStrategy, etc., Power BI, etc., they all have allow you to be able to set up security locally and assign it to users locally, and not necessarily require that you use AD or LDAP as a leverage point or as a pivot point for security, right? So if you're doing that security maintenance manually, then you want to be able to inherit that from that tool directly into the portal, because that is where that content exists. So that's what the security model is. So that's a second option that you would go to if you're not driving security through the AD Office 365 SAML groups within the underlying tool itself. And then the final choice, the one that I think is, these are really the order of preference, right? And the final choice is if there is, for that particular type of content, if there is no security model today, or if that security model is such that it cannot be accessed at all, then you want to be able to configure it directly within the catalog portal, right? To set either a category level or a report level, either to the user or more commonly to the group. You want to be able to set access and controls as to who's going to be able to see that content. So looking at these options, let's talk in a little bit more depth specifically about the first scenario, the one where you're syncing up to like an Active Directory system or a corporate-wide identity system where you're managing group memberships, whether that be Azure AD, on-premise AD, or Office 365 groups, what have you, right? So in that scenario, it really breaks down to the following paradigm. So you have, on the left-hand side, you can see you've got your Active Directory groups, as an example, groups, and each group has a number of users. So you take, and those groups are then inside of your BI tool at the bottom. Any particular group typically has access to a certain set of content. It says, in this example, a set of folders that contain reports, but it can be different things. In Power BI, it might be workspaces or apps that you might use. Each tool has its own paradigm, but it's always sort of groupings of content that you assign these group AD groups to. So if that's the case, then what you do is you simply in your catalog, you set up an alignment where you replicate these groups, you synchronize these groups and their members in an automated fashion. You obviously have some kind of sync script for this. You synchronize it so that those groups exist in the catalog as well with those users. But then when a user is added to the group in the AD system, it will flow through. And then within the catalog, you simply align it to a set of categories that map to the same sort of organizational paradigm as you have in the BI tool. In this case, category maps to folder. And then as soon as you bring the content in from a particular folder in your BI tool, you drop it into the appropriate category in the catalog. Voila, security is maintained from an access perspective because alignment has been established through the AD groups and their memberships and the synchronization that occurs at that level. So that AD group becomes the pivot point, if you like, that helps you kind of link the security systems between the two environments. So that's if you're lucky enough to have a source system where you're using AD or Office 365 or something of that mechanism to drive the security within that system, right? If you don't have that situation, if you've got Tableau environment and everybody in that environment is just doing their own security setup, and it's just I mean there is no centralized AD infrastructure that feeds that from a content management perspective, then you need to do something different. In that situation, you need to bring all of that access list information all from the BI tool into the analytics catalog. So what does that mean? Well, that means there's really three distinct sets of information that have to flow through. And these are usually pieces of information that are collected through an API. So almost all BI tools have an API that can bring us information through. So you've got the user access list, which tells you for this particular, if a user has been directly assigned access to a report, gives you a breakdown of which users have access to which reports. Then you need the group access list. So if you've assigned a group within the BI tool, you've created a group of users and assigned group access to a report or a group of reports, gives you the mapping of group to report access. And then finally, you've got your user to group membership. Since these groups aren't coming from AD or centralized systems, so they only exist in the BI tool, you need to know who are the users that are part of this particular group. And with those three sets of information, once they're woven together, they're synchronized into your analytics catalog, you can essentially replicate the security without requiring any duplication of effort. On a regular basis, you have a sync script, runs a few times a day, brings these three data sets in from your BI tool, synchronizes them to the catalog security model, and you have seamless security synchronization between your BI tool and the analytics catalog. So we talked about security. Let's talk about access requests for a moment, because it's easy to say, this discoverability is important, but discoverability implies that there is an access request workflow, right? It's all well and good for you to tell me, hey, this report exists, but you don't have access to it. I need to have some mechanism to now get access to it. So in this case, there are sort of two ways to typically tackle this problem. And the first one is to say, well, I'm going to, like you see in this example, I'm going to see this is, you don't have access. I'm giving you some metadata, and there's a button somewhere or something that says I want to request access. You click on that, the user clicks on that button. And then the first scenario is they're going to get assigned to, there's some kind of assignment to an appropriate AD group, right? That happens through a support ticket. So you initiate, maybe open a ServiceNow ticket or a Jira ticket, and then that goes through a process to generate that support ticket. And then somebody follows up on that support ticket, assigns access, and so forth. So that's one scenario. Another scenario is that you can push that through at the analytics portal itself. So you can say, I've got my catalog, and I'm using portal and catalog, by the way, synonymously here in this presentation. I've got my catalog, and I'm going to, as part of it, it's going to have a workflow where when I request access to something, it will route the request to the right person, notify them via email, and then they will come in, and that owner of that content will then say, oh yeah, Joe wants access to this. Yeah, based on where he is and what his needs are, he should have access to it. Let me grant him access to it. And then two things happen. One, the user is granted access within the catalog. And then again, if there's no AD group synchronization, then there needs to be a little bit of automation that also grants the user access in the underlying BI tool, because it's not enough for me to be able to see that I can get to the content of the catalog. I've got to be able to click on it and go all the way to be able to consume it. So, those are the two scenarios. Either basically outsource this to some kind of external process, like a support ticketing process or authentication and identity provisioning process, or handle it natively with the portal itself. So those are the two things. So let's talk about best practices, right? As we think about this, what are some of the best practices? So from a discoverability perspective, you want to set a high bar for globally discoverable content. Like I mentioned before, make sure that very little content should be globally discoverable. Otherwise, you're generating a lot of cloud. You want to make sure that most content is discoverable based on business function, adjacent business functions, and sometimes geography comes into this as well, right? I mean, the Latin America reporting, maybe maybe the Mexico reporting is relevant to obviously anybody that's interested in content within Latin America, but probably not so interesting to the group that's responsible for business in Australia, right? So that kind of thing can come into it, but thoughtfully creating that delineation. And then making sure that only the most sensitive content is not discoverable. Because again, anytime you make something non-discoverable, you are increasing the likelihood of that content having been duplicated, right? Somebody looks for it, doesn't find it, doesn't realize it's there, and then they ask an analyst to go create it for them. And then we talked about it. The last point is kind of I summed up already, really avoiding oversharing by making sure you've got the right scope for discoverability. From a security model perspective, right? You want to do your content into categories that align to group access, especially if you have AD. You want to kind of start with that if you have the ability to do that. That's the easiest, most scalable way to work. Wherever you can, do that integration to AD and LDAP systems so that you can leverage what's in place. Wherever you can't, integrate with our underlying BI system. And then as you think about security in general, you want to align your plans and to what's going on within your organization. So if you're going to be using Ping as your SAML provider going forward, build your portal with that, right? If AD is the direction versus SAML for group management, make sure you're using that, right? So really think through where is your organization going and align your plans to that as you're setting up your power. Okay, step number 3. So you've considered security and discoverability. So now you need to consider metadata. Right? Metadata is a very important part of your strategy. And again, here you've got 3 audiences, and each of your 3 audiences is looking for something different, right? So if I'm the BI publisher, right, what am I looking for? Well, I want to have metadata that tells me whether a particular report is a good starting point for my analysis. I'm doing an analysis. I want to know, do I need to rebuild this thing from scratch? Is it something completely new? Or does a report exist out there that does approximately what I need so that I can either use it to answer my question or use it as a starting point, right? Just extend it a little bit, make a copy of it, something of that nature, and be able to get to my answer much more quickly. Right? So that's what I'm looking for. As a BI consumer, I want to know a different slice of that question. I want to know, is this report that I'm looking at, does this actually answer the question I have in mind? I have a business question in mind. I'm trying to find the answer. Does this answer the question? Or do I need to go ask for a new one because I can't find what I need and get my analyst to go build something? So that's what I'm trying to figure out from the metadata. And then the governance team, right? They care about the metadata to know that how are we responsibly handling sensitive information? So how are we adhering to the compliance practices that we have, the regulatory practices that we have, and also the good governance practices that we have to make sure that information is not being consumed improperly, that people are aware of the sensitive information that's there and they're aware of how they should use it. So metadata also has 4 classes of sources that you want to consider when you're thinking of this plan. So you've got the BI tools. Right? Clearly, there's going to be some things, if you're bringing in stuff from Tableau, there's going to be metadata from Tableau, the link, the name, the description, maybe tags, whatever you're maintaining in your Tableau environment. You might have a data catalog system, maybe an Elation or a Purview or a Calibra or Informatica, whatever your system. And it might have a whole bunch of mined lineage information, or you might be keeping additional metadata, glossary of terms, other things in that environment. That's a source of metadata that's indispensable and very important to bring to the portal so that your users can benefit from that. You sometimes have spreadsheets for this, especially for user-generated content. It's very common for there to be somebody responsible for capturing the metadata in a spreadsheet for a particular group, and then that metadata needs to be associated with the content when it's consumed in the catalog. And then finally, that metadata may be in the heads of the folks that are publishing it, but it has not been put down anywhere, in which case there needs to be a manual process by which when you're publishing the content to the catalog, you can enrich your content by adding the metadata at that point of publishing. Now, these different sources in a different way means that there isn't a one-size-fits-all. And you really need to think about how to align the metadata strategy to the type of content that you're bringing in. I'll give you an example of that. Imagine for a moment that these are the metadata fields you're interested in. You know, many organizations have many more than this they want to bring in, but let's imagine just this. So I've got my name, a link to the content description. Is the content certified? What kind of classification does it have? Does it contain PII data? What's the line of business that owns it? Ownership information, some generic, more high-level logical data source information, and maybe detailed lineage type. Right, available. I'm interested in all these three to support all the constituents that we talked about earlier. Right. So I have some Power BI reporting. Well, for that, maybe I will pull the name, the link, and the description directly from the BI tool, directly from Power BI. Just get those out there and land it in the catalog. But then some of these other pieces of content don't exist in Power BI. But I have Purview. You know, I'm using Purview as my data catalog, and I'm going to be capturing all that information in Purview. So then if that's the case, I'm going to get the first three items from Power BI. I'm going to knit that together with all the other pieces of information that I'm getting from Purview, and I get a holistic picture there. Maybe I have Tableau content. Now Tableau not being pulled into Purview. So in that case, but there is maybe a little bit more metadata there. I'm tagging what's certified in Tableau. I'm capturing descriptions in Tableau. So there, the first maybe 4 pieces of metadata are going to be brought in directly from Tableau. And then the rest of the metadata I'm going to capture as part of onboarding the content. So the publisher of the content is going to be responsible for, you know, checking a few boxes and selecting some dropdowns and identifying what those pieces of information are. Well, except for the lineage, which I can get from Tableau, right? So you can see kind of anything I can get in an automated fashion, I want to get from my automated area. If I can't, then I need to be able to make that accessible via onboarding. Maybe I've got SharePoint content. Now there for SharePoint, I can probably get the name, the link to the content, maybe there's a description directly from SharePoint. But the rest of this information, well, I've got a team that's managing that via a spreadsheet. There's a spreadsheet where they have all the key critical SharePoint reports, and they've got all this key metadata, capture that. So in that case, I want to build in just that spreadsheet and assign those fields automatically to the content that's loaded. And of course, in SharePoint, we have lineage because it's just, you know, they're just files. And finally, network drive. So I've got a shared drive out there. Here, I probably only get the name and the link directly from that source, but everything else might be entered as the user identifies as the file I want to register for the catalog for people to be able to find and identify. I'm going to specify all the required metadata that I need as part of that process. So you can see kind of, it's not a one size fits all. Instead, it's a thinking through each area of content and asking the question, how do we most effectively bring all the metadata in a way that minimizes the amount of effort from the community that's publishing it? So best practices. First of all, start with the governance requirements, right? It's very easy to try to just have a whole bunch of different metadata fields, come up with things to capture. Start with what do we need to have from a compliance and governance? Because that's the baseline. That's the stuff that you can use. If there's a carrot and a stick, that's the stick part, right? You can say, well, you have to, when you publish content, you must apply these metadata fields because our regulatory requirements mandate, right? Or our governance team mandates. So therefore you have to do that. And then other metadata, in addition to that baseline required metadata, should be included only when it meets 2 criteria. It should have clear ownership. You should be able to find out how do I get this and who's going to be responsible for setting it. And it should have clear business value in the sense that it really helps with data literacy, it helps with interpreting the content. You can clearly see how not having that metadata significantly degrades the experience that a user will have with the content in the catalog. And then do not try, very important, do not try to boil the ocean. There have been so many governance efforts that have failed because people have spent months trying to define customer, come up with a uniform customer definition across the entire organization, or come up with every single business term and definitions for those. Don't do that. Just figure out what generates value, attack those points, and then deploy with that, and then gradually release other things in phases as you can justify business value for those pieces. So now that you've got your metadata strategy in place, then the next part is to have a publishing strategy. So you know kind of what has to happen within the publishing process, so what metadata needs to be captured, how security and discoverability is going to be managed, what needs to be published. So now you've got to really come up with a plan for publishing that content. And here, there are really 4 buckets, or 4 different techniques that you can follow. So analysts can publish their own content. So just say, hey, you analyst, you Power BI analyst, you're responsible for identifying which Power BI content needs to be brought in and registering it onto the catalog. That's one approach. A second approach is to have a publishing workflow. Hey, it's this group of people that are responsible. As an analyst, you've got to work with a key stakeholder in the governance team or the business, and together you're going to publish this. And I got 2 people turning the key together to actually move things into the process. You can have content auto sync. In other words, there's just automatically stuff is getting published without, a particular sort of gatekeeper involved in that process. Or you can have user publishing. So for user-generated published content, it might not be the analyst at all. It might be just somebody in the business who is responsible for designating that this particular spreadsheet, this particular document, or this group of documents are relevant to be published and shared. And typically in a large solution, you might use all of the above, right? There might be different content, you're going to use different strategies. So let's talk about each of these techniques and when they're appropriate. So analyst publishing. This works when basically in the way where analysts just selects the reports they want to publish, and they specify the extended metadata as part of the publishing process. An example I gave you before, Tableau content, user identifies which Tableau reports they want to put in the catalog, and they add that Tableau metadata as part of that publishing process. Right? And this will work well if a few things hold true. First of all, it needs to be things that do not need coordination among multiple parties to publish. So in other words, this can't be something that is like the financial close reporting where somebody in finance has to bless the numbers before they can be published for the month. Right? It has to be something where the analysts on their own can just go ahead and publish the content. It also has to be the case that a small number of publishers can be trained on the process. Implicit in this is that there is going to be a process. And so you're not going to want to have to maintain the thousands of people that have to publish. It's going to be a challenge to keep them trained up on any process associated with publishing. So this works if you've got maybe a small centralized team that's publishing content, you can train them, and then they can be off to the races. And then the number of reports that are published have to be fairly small, so that it's manageable to the person who's publishing it. The analyst, they don't have to spend a huge amount of time in the publishing process. Because as we discussed before, if you're asking your analyst to spend a large amount of time publishing, they're going to push back and you're going to get compliance issues. So publishing workflow is kind of a step up from the analyst publishing. This is a situation where you need a little more structure. Maybe you've got, in addition to the analyst, somebody from governance team, somebody from business, maybe multiple parties. They need to add to the metadata to participate in the publishing process to make sure that the data is good, that the reporting can be published, right? And this is suitable for that really high impact analysis, right? The most sensitive information, the places where if number is wrong, it can have huge ramifications, either from a liability perspective to business or decisions that are made, et cetera. So you want to have that extra level of vigilance around the publishing process. It also required, you have a lot of metadata that has to be included, and different groups have to be responsible for onboarding that metadata. Analyst doesn't know all the metadata, business has to supply something. Well, that's a reason you've got to do this. And then, there's coordination obviously implicit in this because it's a workflow. And then this is applicable when you have certification and attestation needs. So if you have a requirement to say, I'm going to certify the content, and the analyst maybe just can't certify it on their own. No, it has to be initially certified together with the business. And then every 3 to 6 months, it's going to go through an attestation process where we revalidate that report is still good. Right? This is very common in banks and financial institutions, other places where reporting, you just can't have any kind of errors reporting. So in those situations, then having a workflow is very important because you need to automatically transition content from a published stage to a hey, this is now needs to be reattested and then you get recertified post-published. In user publish, or rather business user publish, this is for user-generated reports, and it's going to be made available to the portal. And here you're saying, there's curation required, so you're not going to be able to say bring everything in from SharePoint or bring everything from this SharePoint folder and bring it in, or this extended metadata that has to be added as part of the publishing process, so therefore it has to be things that we publish one at a time. But there's not a huge amount, because again, if users are publishing it, they're not going to be able to publish thousands of reports a month on this. So it has to be something where in an hour or two per month, I, as a content publisher, can get my content up there, I can add the metadata that I need, and then make it available to the users that should have access. And then the final category, the auto-publish. This is kind of everything happening behind the scenes. So you've got, in this case, you're taking your content from a particular source, and you're automatically publishing it based on a set of rules. So, and some examples of this, you say, well, you know, as soon as an analyst has placed a particular report in a workspace, or then I know that it's good because they've already reviewed it, and I can just go automatically synchronize and bring it into the catalog. Right? Or everything is published in a particular SharePoint site can be brought in, or everything in a SharePoint site with a particular custom field value that's been set can automatically be brought in. Right, so it's not, or reports associated with a specific set of certified data sets can automatically brought in. So I've identified the data set, you know, this is a certified data set. Any report that's in my system that uses that data set, I know because it's a certified data set, it can be brought in and consume the report. So this is not, doesn't mean, auto-publishing doesn't mean you bring in all kinds of junk. You have to be very thoughtful about the publishing process, but it does mean that you don't have an explicit publishing process that happens within the portal where somebody has to, like, you know, push a button to make that happen. It's happening transparently behind the scenes based on a set of rules. And of course, you know, you have to thoughtfully create those rules. So best practices, obviously very important to understand the scope of reporting before you develop a strategy. And, you know, this goes back to the first step. You need to understand what is all the different types of content you want to publish, and then you want to look at the different types of publishing mechanisms you have and align the right mechanism to the right content, so that, you know, so it's effective. Wherever possible, you do want to leverage automation. Right? It's a big mistake to make everything manual, because the more work is required to publish content, the harder it is to get adherence and making sure that everything that's important is getting published in the portal. So that's very important. And then the final piece that often people don't think about, but it's incredibly important, is to have a plan built in from the beginning for reporting obsolescence. So every single piece of content that's being added to the portal, every piece of BI content you have inside of the BI tool, will eventually at some point become obsolete. Right? Your business changes, your data sources change. You know, after some period of time, it's no longer relevant. There's a new report that provides information in a more coherent way that users prefer, or whatever that might be. So you need to have a mechanism by which you are regularly reviewing the content as a content publisher, and the content is being removed. And that can be an automated mechanism. It can be, hey, if something's in the portal and gets no usage for 6 months, it's automatically being moved to kind of into an archive area. Be done that way, or it can be done in more of a pseudo-automated fashion, where your content publishers receive reports once a month saying, "Hey, here's this content when nobody's been using," and they just have to hit a button to move it into the archive area, right? But whatever process you use, having a process built in, making sure you've got the tooling in place to support that process is critically important, because otherwise, if it's one directional, if all you're doing is publishing and publishing and publishing, and you're not pruning and removing and cleaning and making sure it's a highly curated list, over time it's just going to become just this place where there's just a lot of junk, and people are going to get really frustrated because they can't find anything useful in the content because they're just stumbling across things that are not useful. So, having done all this, now the final piece of the puzzle is to make sure that access to reporting is available from everywhere. So the catalog itself can't just be something that I have to get to my, go on my web browser and access. While it's important to be able to get there, and that's going to be a predominant, sometimes dominant access mechanism in most organizations. There are other ways in which people are accessing information. So it's very important to make sure that catalog is accessible over mobile. Right? Because people are sometimes, if your executive might be walking the dog or in a car traveling on a business trip, and they want to be able to get to that key, find a key report. They need to be able to pop open their mobile, look for it, and access it directly there. right? So that's very important. And then it's also important these days with the increasing use of collaboration tools like Slack, like Microsoft Teams, to deliver the reporting in those surfaces as well. And that's going to take two mechanisms. First of all, you need to be able to push there. So you want to be able to say, well, I've got this this report that comes out every Monday morning showing how my product is performing. That should just go directly to the product manager Slack channel, right? So that people can see the report there and see what's going on, or alert them when something like that, when there's a new change in that data. But it also should support pull mechanisms. If I'm in the Microsoft Teams channel where I'm discussing analytics and I want to find a report, I shouldn't have to like go out of there, open my browser, go to the catalog and look for it there. I should be able to just ask a Teams bot, hey, give me this report, and assuming I have access to it, it should just find it for me and show it to me directly in Teams, right? And allow me to get to it from there. So getting to collaboration tools, it's increasingly important to be able to have that, to be able to really cover all the needs of your organization. And then in addition, you want to think about where your users are spending their time, because sometimes your users are spending time inside of applications. So for example, Salesforce. You might have a team that's using Salesforce all the time. That's where they live. That's what they have open all the time. Your sales team or your customer support team. You want to make sure you're embedding your catalog there, right? So that they don't have to go to some other application. They can search and find and consume their reporting content right there. If there's some kind of a wiki or a SharePoint site that your sales team is using to get all the resources for when they're selling, the access to the key reporting should be integrated in there. So that catalog content needs to be available wherever and whenever your users need it in whatever application they're consuming it. And that's an important part of the strategy to think about when you're doing the deployment. So from a best practices perspective, a few other things to consider is that you want this to be a staged rollout, right? In your catalog initiative, you don't want to just roll it out to a huge enterprise right away in one fell shot. You want to kind of identify some stages so that you can identify issues as part of the rollout and gradually adjust for them. That's very important. That's a key element for success. You want to make sure that all content has been published. So I cannot stress that enough. In other words, everything below below the surface of the water needs to be included as relevant to users. Making sure that security and discoverability are working properly, again, in a small community before you roll out. And then probably, I put this last, but it's probably most important. You want to make sure you get your management buy-in up front for the catalog being the universal tool that your users will use to get their content, right? You're going to need, whatever publishing strategy you go with, you're going to need compliance. You're going to need people to come in and publish the content. The only way to get that, and the only way to get is if there's a kind of high level requirement, this is how people are going to consume content. Because if you don't have that, it's just that simple truth that you're not going to get enough compliance in terms of content being published, and therefore users' content is not all going to be there. And when I, as a user, if I come in there and I search and I don't find everything there, I find only half of what I should have access to there, I'm never coming back, right? So it's impossible to get adoption unless all the content is there, and it's impossible to get all the content there unless you have broad-based compliance from publishers. And the only way to get broad-based compliance from publishers to system publishing is to get management buy-in upfront to say, this is going to be our standard for how we're going to access information. This portal or catalog is going to be it's going to be where people access it. That one of the executives at one of our customers said this once to me, if it's not in the catalog, it doesn't exist, right? That needs to be the overall mentality that everyone has, because that will ensure that everything is there. And then with that, then you can maybe roll out to one group at a time until you have the entire organization covered. So just to recap, right, the 5 steps we've talked about them in brief has been, understand the scope of reporting, make sure you know what you're up against, have a kind of a careful plan around both security and discoverability, make sure you've got a good balance there. Establishing a metadata strategy that is going to work for you, that's going to support all 3 of your constituents areas, the analyst, the consumer, and the governance team. developing a publishing strategy that aligns with all the metadata strategy, that aligns with the security system, that aligns with the discoverability plan that you have in place, and then making sure that when you execute on all these things, that you deploy to all the surfaces of the book of information, and you've done it in a way where you have the senior management support necessary to be able to make success.
Well, thanks, Marius. As I warned up front, I thought we'd have a lot of content there to cover, so it's taken us to almost the top of the hour here. A couple of questions have come through on the chat, but we'll follow up directly with those, given respect everyone's time here. But yeah, hopefully this has given you some good ideas. I would encourage you again to reach out if there's any sort of topics you would like us to drill in further in future sessions. But just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and to look out for some additional webinars that we're going to be doing soon. And thanks again, Marius, for your time.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.